So, welcome to our third episode of LinkedIn Live, where we will be continuing to explore the new equation. And with our help today, we have a distinguished guest, our global strategy leader of PwC, Blair Sheppard. Welcome, Blair.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Blair, I have to start with a question on, you recently published a book, actually just before the pandemic.
Yes.
You published a book, so this was late 2019, early 2020.
Mm-hmm.
The book title was 10 Years Till Midnight.
Yes, it was.
That's a dramatic title. Can you share a bit with us? What was the thesis? What did you capture in that book?
Yeah, one of the things to be clear about is I'm one of the world's greatest optimists, right? And PwC doesn't use a word like crisis easily. Right? And so the reason for the book is that we had sort of looked at the kinds of anxieties the world had about 7 or 8 years ago, and then started looking at the data about were they valid? And what we saw was that actually at the heart of those anxieties, which we coined the phrase adapt to describe, right? Were some issues that actually had the following characteristic, right? Which is they were bad last year, they're worse this year, next year they get worse yet again. And if we don't address them in a decade, something goes very dark. Right, so one of those issues had to do with sort of the consequences of growing disparity. One of those had to do with the consequences of technology, sort of our industrial technology system and climate, and the unintended consequences of information technology. And then the other one was that actually institutions were becoming highly distrusted. And that actually that formed a system that you couldn't treat them as independent of each other. And that if we didn't address them really quickly, we would reach midnight. And that's the title of the book.
So the essence of the book was that we have 10 years to fix these.
And that was 2 years ago.
And this was
so
2
we
years
have 8.
ago. Yeah. We have 8. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you how we're doing. But first, I guess coming out of those big megatrends, they're manifesting themselves.
Yes.
In quite disturbing ways.
Yes.
We've just experienced, or we are still in a pandemic.
Yep.
On top of that, we now have geopolitical tension. We have a war in Europe for the first time in a long time. What's your view on these crises that are becoming more and more frequent, it seems?
Yeah, so a couple of things about that I think are important. First one is, we have a war which is pretty bad. I mean, the Second World War was worse, but this is pretty bad, right? We had a pandemic which is pretty bad. The plague was worse, but this is pretty bad. We have inflation. You have to go back 30 years to have something even close to this, right? We have market fragility. You'd have to go back to the Depression to see something that's more fragile, right? You have supply chain risks. You have employees leaving at a huge rate or emigrating from different countries at a huge rate. And so each of those, it's not that we haven't seen them in history before, and it's not that we haven't seen something worse, right? But we've never seen them happen at the same time before. Right? And so what you're seeing is a system of very acute short-term crises, which are simply a result of the issues we describe in the book getting closer. And so I can kind of promise you, if we don't address them in the right way, next year's going to be worse. Right? And so we have to figure out how to address those short-term crises by keeping the long-term in mind, and it's hard.
Yeah, that's hard because it's sort of like the metaphor or the analogy I think of is you have this big comet coming at you, hurling at you, and it's throwing out these meteorites.
It's a great analogy.
And the meteorites are hitting us first.
Exactly.
And we spend all of our energy trying to figure out how to deal with those, which possibly could distract us from dealing with that big comet that's coming our way.
Unless you're intentional, it will distract you, right? So just think about. Let me use PwC as an example. The amount of time we spent on how do we respond to Ukraine, right? The amount of time we spent on what do we do with the Great Departure, right, and the Great Resignation. The amount of time we're spending on how do we deal with inflation. The amount of time, it turns out those take both capital and attentional capacity, right? And so as they come to us and get bigger and roll over each other, less and less attentional capacity available and less capital, either people in the form of capacity or actually money. And so the consequence, if you aren't intentional, they will consume you. And the result is it'll be even worse next year. Right? So Sorry for that story, but it's true.
Yeah, but and it is very real. I mean, I was just in a meeting with the board yesterday of one of our clients, and one of the big conversations was around what do we do here and now?
Yeah.
Do we rewrite all of our strategies? Do we become more short-termish in our thinking and in our actions? And I suppose what you're saying is that, well, yes, you have to be. However, you need to do it still with that sort of long-term in mind.
Yeah, it's actually, I mean, it's a difficult thing to do, but what we have to do in a way is be really curious and informed about the deeper things that are happening to us, right? Really understand what's going on with climate and what's required, right? And it's profound what has to happen, right? Really understand why we have disparity and what's it doing. Really understand why institutions aren't trusted. Just understand that. Really understand the consequences of global polarization with our own societies. Understand those well. And how you want to position yourself in light of those, right? Sort of have a vision about where you want to go and take the crisis as both the crisis that needs to be responded to, but an opportunity to then make progress toward the thing you're trying to achieve, right? So there's some easy examples of this, which is the conversation in Europe now about, yes, we're going to have a tough winter 2023, but isn't that an opportunity for us to progress against the energy system we're going to have, right? Yes, we have to figure out how to keep people in the short term, but is that an opportunity for us to rethink what it means to sort of make this a compelling and exciting place for people to be? Yes, and so always use the crisis as an opportunity to make progress toward the deeper issue. And
I suppose in some ways, COVID, the pandemic, has taught us that that's possible, right? I mean, obviously there was tremendous pain for many coming out of that pandemic, so it is an absolutely regretful thing. At the same time, we saw lots of innovation being accelerated and some pretty big challenges being solved very, very quickly as a consequence.
Yeah, two great examples, right? And both of them, the important point is that we actually saw we could do things at massive scale way faster than we thought we could. So that the lesson of COVID is that actually 8 years feels really short, but actually if we move at the speed of COVID, it's not, we still have time, right? So think about the two things. So typically it would take 10 to 20 years to invent a vaccine like we did, 9 months, right? Typically it would take decades to move people online the way we did, 2 months, right? And so things that you would imagine were impossible to do at speed, we did. So part of what we have to do is essentially use the crisis as an attentional focusing capacity and say, so how are we going to drive the thing we need to do really, 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 really fast so we get there? Because then what happens is you knock the blocks off sequentially, but it feels almost simultaneous because you're doing things massively and fast.
So in doing that and in achieving that, what are the building blocks that are crucial for organizations to have in place in order to future-proof themselves into that sort of future position?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things, and whether you look at it risk or opportunity, right? There's sort of three components you need to have in place. The first one is you need to understand the things that are given, that are here, that we can respond to, and that should inform every decision you take, right? So we know we have to completely remake our industrial technology system because of climate. That's a given, right? So make progress on that, right? You know, so understand for your own organization, because there's a lot of factors that are given, which are the 2 or 3 that are really material to you as an organization, and always have those in mind. Right? The other piece is that there's an awful lot of uncertainty in the world, right? Because it turns out the uncertainty comes because these things are interdependent and play off of each other, but also because people respond to them, and the world changes as a result of that response, right? So if we actually had an electric plane that could fly all over the world at the same price point as carbon-based planes, it's a game changer, right? So things will change because we'll respond. So the consequence is you've got to think about kind of how I envision kind of possible futures in real time. Usually you do kind of scenario analysis once every 5 years or once a year. It's a continuous dynamic conversation with yourself.
Always on scenario analysis.
So you drive the given, you respond to the opportunity, and in that you actually are both de-risking the world and you're also sort of creating real potential for yourself. And then the final one is, in order to do what I just described, we have to lead differently. We have to be a completely different kind of leader.
And what kind of leader do we need? to lead this?
We have to have a leader who can manage things that feel mutually contradictory. So let me give you two examples of what I mean. So you cannot possibly lead the world today without being technically capable, right? If you don't understand technology, you're dead in the water, right? Because you're irrelevant. Right? The problem is the kind of training and education we do to prepare people in technology doesn't get them to understand that actually there's a human system in which that needs to be embedded. So you actually need to be an astute electrical engineer and an astute sociologist, psychologist, political scientist. Show me the university that teaches that curriculum, right? Show me the management development or employee development program that teaches that curriculum. We actually do one or the other. You actually have to be both. Right? Another example is that except in startups, we all have a legacy. So part of what you have to do is say, what's core to who we are, that's sort of the baby in the bathwater, right? And then let's protect that tradition, but then progress forward, right? So you just think about, PwC as an example. There's things that make us special. So as we innovate, we can't just break it, right? So we have to sort of preserve tradition, but then radically innovate around it. So let me use, on that one, the example of the vaccine. So both of the organizations that created the mRNA vaccine kept one thing constant, which is they're going to do development in as conservative and careful a way as you can possibly prove that it works. They're going to overdo whatever the regulator is going to require. That's the tradition they kept constant. Everything else changed. Simultaneous creation and testing of products, manufacturing ahead of actually having approval, new ways of doing the science, all of that changed, but they kept the core there because they knew if they didn't do that, people wouldn't trust the drug on the back end.
Right, and I suppose it was the ability to be both human-led and technology-powered in that allowed them to do that.
And there's four others, but too short a time.
And there are four others, and which sort of leads me to the belief that actually it will be super difficult to find the superhuman that has all of those.
And they probably fly and walk on water. Yes,
right, exactly. So is this sort of finally the real business case for diversity? Because
completely.
We will not be able to represent all of these different paradoxes or profiles in a leadership unless we have genuine inclusion and diversity.
I think there's two arguments for diversity, right? The first one is actually the interdependence among the crises, both short-term and long-term, right? And so someone will understand one of those, but not all of them, right? And it's the ability to put it together, right? And so we actually need true multidisciplinarity and true difference of experience as well, right? So if you understand what it means to be disaffected, it's helpful to have been disaffected, right? Then the other piece, I think, is actually no one has all of those attributes, and actually different attributes tend to be created by different life experience. And so you need the team for both the strategic reason and the leadership reason both. And I think if we don't, it ain't gonna work.
And that in itself sets up huge requirements on leadership to manage that situation.
God bless the leader today.
God bless the leader. So I think that part of what we're seeing then is that organizations, in order to do all of what we're now talking about, they need to somehow, first they need to reimagine sort of what is my positive contribution to the world that makes me needed. Basically.
Yes. Yeah. There's a bit of a dream in that, right? Which is take what makes you essentially who you are as an organization, both capability and kind of purpose and other, and then imagine what that looks like in the future, right? In a way that creates way more value than today, by the way. If you do it right, the amount of value you can create in this world is huge. So the winners of this era will write history for 50 years, just like the ones in the Depression did.
And those winners are the ones that manage to combine purpose, impact, positive impact on society, with a business model that consistently delivers against that financial performance in terms of profit.
It turns out if you don't have money, you can't invest. So you got to make profit, right? If you invest and you're not achieving something bigger than that, then you won't last very long.
Right.
And so it's profit plus impact.
And the profit plus impact, you talk about it as sustained outcomes.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, this is PwC's particular variant of this issue, right? You sort of come back and say, what's our role in the world? You sort of say, where do we start, right? We start kind of, we have a bit of a premise that we do trust for a living, right? And we have a bit of a premise that we advise people, right? But what we have to do is up our game. Essentially say, if we're going to help the world get where the world needs to go, And if we're going to make a decent living in the process of doing that, somehow we have to address the profound trust issues in the world. And we actually have to make a promise to our clients that we're not giving you a deliverable, we're actually helping you achieve the outcome that's the reason for that in the first place. And we'll put those two things together, because actually you can't achieve outcomes without trust, and you can't achieve trust without outcomes, because people distrust you because the outcome's not there, right? So there's these three pieces: trust plus sustained outcomes. And it turns out that's our unique way in which we can contribute value. And it really is the case that if we achieve that, we will have a really decent living, so profit will be there. But even more importantly, the aperture just grew. In two ways, right? We actually can have way more value add to the people we work with as clients, but we'll also help the world become what the world can be. So think about waking up in the morning and saying, I can make a really good living, and I'm creating a world that my grandkids can feel good in. That's kind of a nice thing to talk about over breakfast.
That's very nice. It's very inspiring. But just to make that a bit more concrete then, for those that listen, how would that manifest itself for a client of ours when we deliver trust and sustained outcomes?
Yeah, so really quickly, the first one is, whenever a client says, I need your help, you begin with the question, why? What really is the reason you're trying to do this? So which constituent out there cares about what you're asking us to do, and why are they asking for it? Right? And know the answer to that question. Now that defines the outcome, or outcomes, right? For whom? The second piece is, who are the parties that need to believe in you, buy what you're doing, trust you, in order to achieve that outcome, right? And then help them navigate those two things simultaneously, right? The second piece, or you could start with the trust question, which is to say, who are the constituents in the world that really matter to your organization, right? And it's more than they used to be, by the way. What do they care about? And then how do you create sort of the narrative that sort of puts all of those perspectives together into a proposition for the value the firm's going to create in the world? And then you sort of say, now let that drive the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And so you could either start with trust and get to outcomes, or start with outcomes and get to trust. But in either way, you've got to do both together, which is why the plus sign in the middle.
Sort of a virtuous circle that the more trust you have, the more you are free to explore creating those sustained outcomes. And the more sustained outcomes, the more trust you get.
So think about two circles, right? One circle begins with sort of who are the constituents or stakeholders that matter to us? What do they care about? Right? What does that mean, therefore, the outcomes that matter to them, right? Or what's happening in the world in terms of the way we started the conversation? What's the capability we would bring to bear against that? And what are the outcomes we need? Hopefully those converge. The strategic conversation and the stakeholder conversation converge into a set of outcomes. And then you have to obviously measure it, right? One of the things we bring is the ability to measure and report. And then the circles continue, right? And it just flows. And if they work really well, it becomes kind of an infinite loop that feeds each other.
Right. And I think these challenges that we're talking about and the opportunities that come with them, they're big. They're systemic.
Yes.
No one organization or no one discipline will solve it for themselves, I suppose. So when we're talking about how we can help clients, we sometimes talk about us as a community of solvers.
Yes.
So can you just elaborate a little bit on why is PwC the partner in taking on some of these big challenges?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, first of all, if you just stay within the client firm, right? It's a multidisciplinary problem that we're talking about. There's not one function anymore, right? And so you need an organization that has the ability to sort of have a conversation with all those functions in an integrated manner. But you made it more interesting, and it is more interesting, right? Which is actually, it sits outside the walls of one organization. So if you say the point about what do we do about climate, right? We have to change the way in which we create the ways in which people eat. We have to change the ways in which people move. We have to change the ways in which people live in offices or at home. We have to change the ways in which we make the things that we use every day, and we have to change the energy system that supports that. I think I just described we had to change everything about how we live, right? That's a big deal, right? And it turns out that no one firm can do that alone. And the interesting issue, if you optimize for a single firm, you're sub-optimizing for the system. So someone has to help the world address the kind of integrated systemic questions. Now, I don't mean to say that we're the only one, right? But we're in a unique position of being in every country in the world in a very sort of intimate, unique way in each country. We kind of touch every part of organizations. We're involved with virtually every industry from soup to nuts. Right? And so it's incumbent upon us to actually be the party that convenes those conversations to some part and help people understand how they make the transformation in their own form to create the transition that the larger society needs. That's a mouthful, by the way.
That is a mouthful. That is a mouthful. So, and in that, what are the, if we then try to make that mouthful a bit more concrete, what are the services that you would sits underneath trust as well as sits underneath sustained outcomes?
So one of the mistakes we make, let me do the negative version of that, right? One of the mistakes we make is we say that trust is only an assurance problem, right? Now it is an assurance problem, but it's not only an assurance problem, or that sustained outcomes is only a consulting problem, right? I mean, it turns out that if you buy the argument I just made, those two things bleed into each other, right? So there's the basic things you do as services, which is financial consulting or operations consulting or information technology consulting, and there's tax work and there's legal work and there's reporting work and there's the audit, right? And so all of those are there. I think there's two ways in which it changes. The first is it's actually a combination of those pieces that matter, not them standing alone. So think about the difference between going and ordering a thing on a menu a la carte versus actually putting patterns of those things together to create table d'hote. The world is now table d'hote, right? So it's the integration of the services. And the other one is there's things that are uniquely important about where we're going in the future that you have to add, right? So we probably have to add some additional pieces around what does it mean to do effective transformation. We probably have to add some pieces about what does it mean to address climate issues. Probably have to add some issues around, there's unique issues in doing deals today that are quite different, right? And so there's components that are new or twists on old that need to be added. But I think it's actually the integration of piece parts that's even more important.
That's super interesting. So I suppose adding the impact to the profit is what opens up that aperture.
Exactly.
Because you're saying, basically, you're going back to your purpose as an organization. You're saying, I want to solve for something which is a really big problem, a really big challenge, a really big need.
Yes.
Which in turn creates a lot of innovation space as well, right?
Exactly.
And opens up all of these business opportunities.
Completely.
Now, you've just been visiting us in Sweden for the last couple of days. You met a lot of the Swedish companies, our clients here. What's your read of where we are in relation to this shift that I suppose every company and every country needs to go through in creating that model of combining impact and profit?
So I probably shouldn't say you are the best in a couple of areas, but you're pretty darn close, right? So, because I could think of one that's pretty good and maybe a tie, but the combination is pretty amazing, right? So you actually have probably one of, if not the most compelling venture capital consortia that's driving towards sustainable outcomes anywhere in the world in Nordsken, right? And all the players that are part of that. You probably have one of the best kind of private equity firms that's focused on sustainability in the world. You probably have one of the best sort of large enterprises that actually has decided it's going to invest in sort of really important sustainable solutions, right, in the world. And you have more than one in each case, right? But I'll just do three, right? That's kind of a pretty interesting combination for a country of your size, right? So you know, I live in the United States to sort of say you may have the best at sustainable venture capital example of anywhere in the world. That's a mouthful for the people in Santa Clara. They wouldn't like that very much, or Palo Alto, right? To sort of say you've got maybe the best private equity firm in the world. There's some people in New York who wouldn't like that very much, or London wouldn't like that. But I think the thing that's important in that is that what is it about Sweden that caused that to occur? And so if I step up a level and say, what do I think is the theme in this country, right? I think you have a set of people who actually care in a way that's remarkable as a nation. And have said, we're going to put our money where our mouth is. So the country begins with the proposition, I can spend my life earning a living, or I can spend my life helping the world address the fundamental issues it has and as a result of that, earn a really good living, right? That choice is a choice every person in the world can make, every country in the world can make, every organization in the world can make. It just feels like you do it systematically in Sweden, right? So there's two things that we need to export from Sweden, right? One of them is actually the model that sits in each of those, right? Sort of, what does it mean to be a private equity firm that just grew like crazy because just sustainability matters? What does it mean to be a venture capital sort of house that actually sort of attracts people who understand what it means to solve problems at scale, real problems at scale? But I think the thing that the magic in that is the point you raised, which is you discovered that when you do that, the potential to be successful as a business is way bigger because we just opened the aperture, right? We were swimming in a swim lane, and now it's the whole pool, and pretty soon it's a lake and then it's an ocean, right? And so you now have the examples that are repeating themselves again and again and again to sort of say, here's what it looks like. And so I think a lot of the world should come study you and figure out how to do it themselves.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting, and I think it's a huge opportunity for Sweden. I think, I mean, I really picking up on what you're saying. I think we have values that are very in line with the whole notion of impact, sustainability, nature. I think, and equitable, just. I think we are good at collaboration.
Yes.
Collaboration is we're pretty masters of collaboration.
It's critical.
Actually, as Swedes or Scandinavian. And then I think we celebrate entrepreneurship.
Yes.
Which is a vital factor in fueling this, I think, ecosystem, both for, like you mentioned, Norway, and of course that is all of an entrepreneur ecosystem.
Yeah.
But I think we're also finding, similarly in the digital transformation, we're finding that a lot of that innovation power then collides with a big organization in exciting acceleration programs or collaborations between startup or scale up and big company, and then it sort of contaminates those big organizations and it drives innovation through in a pretty unique way.
Yeah, I'll tell you what's really interesting though, right? So in a sense, every country has its own kind of inequities, right? And Sweden is not without inequities, right? But actually, it's a pretty fair country. So what's interesting is the country where actually there is fairness already, that's actually most preoccupied with doing things that are fair, right? It's a country that's actually pretty digital already, that's actually most preoccupied with becoming even more digital, right? It's a country that's actually pretty clean air, pretty nice place to live, that's actually most worried about preserving the environment, right? And so I think one of the things that you have as an advantage is actually you're already partway there, and so you know how valuable it is. So I think one of the things we have to do is actually have people see that you're doing it and you don't have to. Now the rest of us have to, right? Now it turns out you do, right? Because of, take climate for example. You're not going to survive the consequence of climate if we don't. But you don't have to, and so you have the privilege to do it. But you chose to. You could have sat back and been fat and lazy and said it's fine, right? I think there's another thing that's in your story that's interesting, which is, like many countries, and this was the school I used to be dean at, right? People would say, I want to go work for an investment bank or a professional services firm, and I hope some do because we need them, right? But essentially there was this change in tone in Sweden in the last 4 or 5 years that says, that's not enough. We need some people to actually go build some stuff, right? And if we lose people from PwC to actually go save the world through entrepreneurial activity or really cool private equity, I'm fine with that, right? Because that means we're going to get the next ones to come join us and then be able to do that,
Absolutely.
right? And so I think there's some magic in that that pretty fun to watch.
Yeah. Okay, Blair, final question. 2 years ago, 10 years to midnight. What is it that makes it 80% left? We've done 20%. Where are we? Are we better off? Are we worse off? What's your view?
We're in a race and we're losing. Now, I don't mean to say that we'll lose, right? We're in a race and we're losing. So let me use the analogy, right? So let's imagine you're a world-class athlete, and you went to the Olympics and you didn't medal. That should give you the reason to want to try harder for the next 4 years. Now, actually, the greatest Olympians of all time, their first Olympics weren't very good. Take Michael Phelps. He didn't do all that. He did okay by most human standards, but by his standard, didn't do very well. So what did he do? He went in the pool and he worked way harder. And then in the next one, he was even better. And then the next one, he actually was miraculous, right? So I don't mean to say that we're going to lose a race. I mean to say we're behind. We're running against a bunch of forces, and they're getting harder every year, which means we got to get in the pool, we got to get on the track, whatever your favorite analogy would be for the Olympics, and we got to work harder.
And the opportunity is to win, because that we have to.
We have no choice. This is the important point. We have no choice. So it turns out Michael Phelps could have gone to be an artist if he chose to. Probably wouldn't have been as good as he was a swimmer, right? We don't have a choice. We're in the pool, if you stay with the analogy. And if we don't win, we lose.
And from a Swedish perspective, I suppose that we should continue, because we're working hard, but we should practice even harder, because somehow we seem to be, maybe not in the lead, but we're up there in the front. But we also need to make sure that we take this and we actually share this and we scale it, because us just winning this race for sure isn't going to be enough.
Exactly. So let's stretch the analogy. It's going to go way too far. Stretch the analogy. But actually, what has to happen is that if you stay with that analogy, the athlete, the Olympic athlete, has to teach the training methods to everybody else, and has to inspire other people to say, you can beat me, come prove it. And actually the friendly competition that evolves from that then actually causes the rest of the world to try to be Sweden. Right? And you'd be fine if the UK beat you, by the way, because that meant the world you're living in is a better place. Right?
And I will tell you a story that there was this Swedish athlete that just won 2 gold in the Winter Olympics in skating. And he then published his entire training regimen for everyone to learn from. So maybe we should follow his example.
Exactly, just up the game, and then what happens is the competition is better next time. And for what it's worth, if what we're doing is competing on how to create value in a world that we left for our kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews that's way better, so be it.
Great. Blair?
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it.